You, Senator Ludlam.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. CDF, I want to go to some of the matters that you raised in your opening statement and some of your subsequent comments, particularly about operations in Iraq and Syria. I just want to start with Iraq. You might have covered this earlier in the day, but can you talk us through the process of how you evaluate airstrikes? Let's maybe just confine comments to Iraq for the time being, and what the sort of approval chain is. Because I think I was out of the room when you were going through it. You said around 2,000 weapons had been used. I think you said about 2,300 airstrikes in Iraq, or
381.
Sorties, not necessarily
sorties, not strikes.
That's
okay,
right,
got it.
Yeah.
And about I think I heard 48 or so in
48
Syria.
in Syria.
What's the decision-making process around whether to actually attack or not?
Okay, so there are two different types of approach that we have. We have deliberate strikes or dynamic. So deliberate go through a deliberate planning process of developing the target set over with the full intelligence over a period of time to be able to then engage a target. Dynamic would be in response to tasking from the ground commanders predominantly, or tasking that's picked up by intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance assets that might be airborne during the time of a mission being okay. Airborne. Regardless of the process, one being longer than the other, we're bound by our targeting protocols to always abide by international law, always operate within our rules of engagement, always look to be proportionate, discriminate and ensure that there's a military advantage from that particular engagement.
Okay. And Australia's rules of engagement are set by Australia, they're not
by Australia.
Handed to us by anybody else? Okay. When you say some of the dynamic strikes can be coordinated with commanders on the ground, are our pilots in direct contact with Iraqi officers, or does it go through some kind of coalition chain of command before it gets to the Air Force?
So they will talk to, and I will check whether they do talk to Iraqi commanders on the ground directly or not, and I'll get back to you on that one, but predominantly they work through coalition command chains in response to an Iraqi request for a strike. They may find a mortar team that's pinning them down. They may have discovered a target through intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance measures that needs to be engaged to provide that military advantage for those forces to be able to conduct their task.
Okay. And are these all channelled through some kind of central decision-making node?
So they're all channelled through a central decision-making process. Depending on the target and depending on where it is and the assessment of the target, it may go to a higher command, and so there might be targets that we engage in near restricted target list or target list targets. For example, you might have a school or something like that. And so if there's to be collateral damage or anything like that to those sorts of targets, it'll go to a higher authority. If it in the targeting process not deemed for that to occur, then it'll stay at the lower level. But always through the process, always abiding by rules of engagement, laws of armed conflict, and the targeting process.
I understand that the United States government and maybe other coalition forces in the area would consider themselves bound by the rules of armed conflict as well, but they also operate under different rules of engagement, I would have thought.
So the coalition as a whole abide by the laws of armed conflict, the proportionality, the discrimination. Rules of engagement each have their national rules of engagement, as you would expect, but having a look across those rules of engagement, there may be some differences in some areas, but across the board they're relatively similar.
Okay. What I'm trying to understand, I guess, one of the things I'm trying to understand is the degree to which Iraqi authorities are a part of that decision-making process and at what level. I presume you don't seek authorisation from Iraqi authorities with every strike?
The Iraqis are a part of the approval process for every strike.
They are a part of the approval process for every strike. Okay.
Now, whether or not that's the ground commander on the ground or it's up through the chain of command, there's an Iraqi government representative in that decision-making process.
Okay, so there's no Australian strike conducted without some kind of Iraqi consent process at some level of the...
That's right.
Okay, thank you. You were speaking before when you were engaging the question of the attack in March that left more than 100 civilians dead, of some of the tactics, some of the urban warfare and human shield tactics that are being employed, but also the very high density of civilians in the old city of Mosul and West Mosul in particular. And given that established pattern of use of human shields by ISIS and obviously the difficulty of identifying civilians, it sounds utterly diabolical. Has there been any consideration of ceasing to use explosives with wide area effects, knowing how densely packed that quarter of the city is?
Yes, there has. And so we have a number of different weapons types that can be chosen for those particular strikes depending on the effect. And so you could mitigate the effect through fusing of the weapon. You can mitigate the effect through the choice of the weapon that you're dropping. You can have a low collateral weapon. So it just depends on what the target is, where it is, what's the effect you're trying to achieve. And again, we'll look for the minimum level of effect to achieve the task. And so if it's a mortar team that's sitting there in a corner of a yard, a low collateral weapon will do that, minimise the risk to anywhere else around that target area.
Okay. Is there any kind of standard method for calculating potential civilian casualties? And I know it sounds real simple when we're saying it quickly in this committee room, but how is that done? Yes,
there is, and I won't talk about it in an open forum like this, but there is a process that you go through in a particular area where there are set ratios of civilians that may or may not be in that particular area, day, night, as you sort of look through the different environment, whether it be urban, non-urban, factories or not. And so you work right through all that and you have particular assessments around all that you factor in, and then you take that into account in your decision-making process.
Okay. I understand why you probably wouldn't want to be going into too much detail in here. Are you familiar with the work of Air Wars?
That's a website, yes I am.
Well, it's a bit more than a website. I mean, it's a small but fairly reasonably well-resourced research team that's doing independent assessments.
It's self-proclaimed. I jump on the webpage, I see it occasionally, so yes, I am aware of it, but it's a journalist-based group. That's right.
That's right. Well, I understand they've actually worked quite closely with US military forces, and while estimates of civilian casualties disagree, there seems to be a measure of respect paid their work by US military commanders. Yeah,
so they're one of the sources that we look to get information back on potential civilian casualties. The other is the Syrian Observatory, another group through the UK who have very good sources. And we also work back through civil authorities in the various areas, even in Mosul. At the moment, and our own assessments and what we're finding to look at assessment of civilian casualties. I think that's where you're heading with the conversation.
Yeah, it is. Well, particularly with regard to Air Wars, they have described Australia as one of the least transparent members of the coalition fighting ISIS based on, for some reason, our failure to systematically report the time, place and the targets that it strikes. Do you have any details you can provide us as to the number of civilian casualties that have occurred as the result of Australian airstrikes in Iraq and separately in Syria since operations began there in September 2015?
So the first thing about Air Wars, I think they're selective in how they put that statement, because they put the statement there that we don't report our strikes. Similarly with the other coalition nations, yet we were all rolled in under the coalition reporting. That when you have a look at that table, they put a little asterisk under the US, yes, but it's rolled into coalition reporting, just as the Australian strikes are.
So we were in aggregate figures, but not separate?
Even in the reporting. So there's a daily report of where the strikes occur for the coalition. Now, back in early March, the the coalition looked at how the reporting was being done for airstrikes. And at that stage, we see that the coalition was going to change the way they were reporting. I had my team look at the way we were reporting, and since then we adjusted it. So as of the 1st of May, we now go out fortnightly with our strikes, with the details of where we've
Got that?
where we strike.
Thank you. Can I put a couple of questions on notice, because I suspect I'm going to get the wind up from the chair shortly. Whether you can provide us, I'm not expecting you to have this at the table with you, could you provide us on notice the number of civilian casualties that have occurred since September 15, as a result of Australian airstrikes? The number
So I can say that now. As a result of Australian airstrikes, with the information we have, we do not have any evidence of a civilian casualty in that period. Now, I'll caveat that any information that comes in, we then look back across our strikes. Any additional information that we might gather, and I am aware of the Air Wars article that went out in the last few days about there being 80 coalition civilian casualty events that haven't been classified, and they're providing extra information for that. But on our information to date so far with our Hornets, we've had no evidence of that. But it's not stopping us re-evaluating as that information comes in.
Yeah, okay, I would expect so. Could you also provide details, if they exist, of the number of combatant casualties that have resulted since September 2015?
I don't track body counts.
You don't?
I don't track body counts.
Does anybody?
The coalition may have that. I don't track that. We will have a look at that data for you.
Whether, I mean, not you personally, obviously, but nobody is tasked to keep track of how many combatants are being killed?
No, I look at the effect that is achieved. Did we stop that mortar team engaging the CTS? Did we stop that VBIED getting through? We'd look at that sort of effect.
All right.
So I'm not going to get into that body count mentality that you see from conflicts in the past. I don't think that's the best way to measure this.
Certainly wasn't trying to invoke a body count mentality, and I understand why you're cautious, but it's interesting that there's no record.
But I do I had it on the record this morning in my statement, and you missed it. But we do track the Iraqi casualty numbers in this, and so just for the fight for Mosul alone, the Iraqi security forces have lost over 1,000 soldiers and upwards of 6,000 casualties. So
I was watching your statement on the monitor, and I wasn't physically here. I've got two more very brief ones. One of them just reminds me, I didn't put to you, with the Iraqi authorities in the chain of command deciding whether or not Australian aircraft can strike or not. Do the Iraqis have a veto, and have they invoked it in the past?
So in the targeting approval process, each decision-making point has the chance to veto a strike. And early on in the planning, the various areas of the decision makers can make a decision on which is the best platform to do it, and just approve the best weapon as well. So yes, they would have the chance to do that.
All the way up into including the pilot?
Yes.
Yeah. Last one, and I suspect this might be, I'll leave it to you to tell me how difficult it is to identify. In Iraq, the ADF is there at the invitation of the Iraqi authorities. I'm interested in how this is going to work, or if it's going to work at all, when the focus shifts into Syria, into Raqqa in particular, which is going to be another example of potentially horrendous close quarter fighting in a civilian area. What thinking have you guys done, or through you, Minister, if you would prefer, as to how this is going to work in a country where there is no invitation for Australians to have military assets or personnel? So
the operations we currently carry out in Syria, and when you look at the statistics, and I did read those numbers out before, I'm happy to provide those to you again. The operations we do into Syria are on collective self-defence of Iraq. And so all along, the mission hasn't changed since October 14 when we went in, which was to be a part of a coalition that was looking at degrading and ultimately defeating Daesh in Iraq. and giving the Iraqis the wherewithal to secure their borders. And that mission hasn't changed in that period. And so if we were to change that mission, that would require us to go to government and government to provide a whole new consideration of what we may or may not do.